Hello, welcome back to our discussion of the cardiovascular system. In this video, we're going to be talking about these physics concepts of pressure and resistance because they have a lot of bearing on the cardiovascular system and how blood moves through the cardiovascular system. So it helps to understand these concepts before we really delve into how they come into play in our bodies. Okay, so I'm going to start with introducing this concept of hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that is exerted by a fluid on its container. So if you look at this diagram here, the hydrostatic pressure is indicated by these arrows here. There's also hydrostatic pressure all over the figure, but it just happens to be indicated down here, okay? In physiology, we use these units, millimeters of mercury, to measure pressure. Okay, so a millimeter of mercury is the pressure that you would get if you had a 1 millimeter high column of mercury that was a centimeter squared in cross-sectional area. Okay, so it would be the pressure that you would experience at the bottom of that column. Okay, all right. So let's take a look at this diagram and explore it a little bit more. Okay, if we look at these 3 points in this diagram, the pressure at those 3 points is going to be the same. Okay, you can think about this in a couple different ways. One is that each of these columns, which we're assuming to be identical, is exerting a certain amount of pressure on the bottom, right? So they're the same height. They're going to be exerting the same amount of pressure at these points on the bottom. Another way to think about it is that since the pressure at the bottom is the same at these 3 points, they can support the same amount of water above them. Okay, so we have this pressure pushing down and the same amount of pressure pushing up from the bottom to support this column of water. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at what's going to happen. So this is, so notice that in this diagram, we have a stopper in the end of this tube right here. Let's imagine what happens when we take that stopper out. Okay, so when we take that stopper out, we're going to get movement of water. Okay, that's actually due to a difference in pressure, which we're going to talk about later. But the main point I want to make here is that as that water moves, it actually loses energy from friction. So it's going to experience friction with the sides of the tube, and it's going to lose energy, and that energy translates into a pressure loss. Okay. The longer you travel, through the tube, the more energy you're going to lose and the more pressure you're going to lose. Okay, so let's consider this question right now. How is the pressure at these 3 locations going to differ from each other once we have this situation where we've removed the stopper? Okay, so I would like you to take a moment and think about, well, oh yes, take a moment and think about that. Sorry. Okay, so you probably saw this, but hopefully it also makes sense to you that you're going to have less pressure as you go down here, right? So basically what's happening is you have water starting here. It's going to have a certain amount of pressure. As it moves to this location, it will have lost a little bit of pressure. And then as it moves to this location, it will have lost even more pressure. As you move to this location, you will have lost even more pressure. Okay, and so this difference in pressure is shown as these different size arrows here. So you have a larger arrow here indicating larger pressure and a smaller arrow here showing less pressure, okay? Next question, how is the height of the water columns going to compare now that we have these different amounts of pressure at these 3 points, okay? Take a moment to think about that. Okay, so hopefully you figured out that the columns are going to be different heights, right? So since we have a large amount of pressure here, we can support a larger amount of water here. Basically, this is pressure that's pushing up. It's going to be able to support a large amount of pressure pushing down from this water here. We have a moderate amount of pressure pushing up here. That's going to be able to support a moderate amount of water exerting a downward pressure on this point, and so on. So we have a small amount of pressure pushing up here. That's going to be able to support a small amount of pressure pushing down due to this column of water, okay? So the amount of water that we can support is going to decrease as we go from left to right because we have less pressure as we go from left to right. Hopefully that makes sense to you. All right, next concept that I want to bring up here is this, the fact that liquids are not compressible. Okay, so that's very important because we're going to be looking at blood in the cardiovascular system. Blood is a liquid, therefore, blood is not going to be compressible. So let's just think about this, okay? So let's imagine that you have a water balloon filled with water. If you push on the outside of it, hopefully you know from experience that you can't make that balloon any smaller, right? So what happens if you push on one area is it's just going to bulge out on another area. And so you can't compress that liquid because liquids are not compressible, okay? However, when you press on the outside of the water balloon, what you're doing is you're transferring energy into the water that's in the balloon. So the pressure inside of the balloon is increasing, okay? And you can see this as you, like, if you were to poke a hole in the balloon, right? So if you poke a hole in it, that water squirts out, right? With a lot of like pressure behind it, okay? And that's because it has taken on that pressure from when you squeeze the balloon. Like as you're squeezing the balloon, you're putting more pressure on it, poke a hole, that water is going to squirt out far, okay? So, so this happens in the heart too, right? So when the heart pumps, we exert a lot of pressure on the blood. That's going to allow the blood to move through the cardiovascular system,